God gave the early church one command. They were to proclaim the gospel, the kingdom rule of Jesus, in Jerusalem, Judea, Samaria, and ultimately to the end of the earth. Now, the first 10 years of the church were focused primarily on Jerusalem, Judea, and Samaria. And then came persecution. Now, from that persecution, that is what brought the gospel to the Gentiles, and the early church began to reach people in the ends of the earth. Now, the church in Antioch sent Paul and Barnabas apart to go out to reach people, and as we saw last time we were together, that God opened doors. Now, as you read through the story of the early church, one thing that should stand out to us is the fact that Christianity was anything but boring. In fact, throughout the book, we find people living on the edge, riding the wave, if you will, and making a difference. Now, Acts chapter 14 is no exception. In it, we find Barnabas and Paul going from place to place, sharing the gospel, and it's an absolutely incredible ride. And so next on Digging Deeper, I want to look with you at their experience and see if we could possibly glean some practical principles. Now, chapter 14 of Acts breaks down into three main points. The first one is found in Acts 14, verses 1 through 6, where it says, "Now at Iconium they entered together into the Jewish synagogue, and they spoke in such a way that a great number of both Jews and Greeks believed. But the unbelieving Jews stirred up the Gentiles, and they poisoned their minds against the brothers. And so they remained for a long time, speaking boldly for the Lord, who bore witness to the word of his grace, granting signs and wonders to be done by their hands. But the people of the city were divided, and some sided with the Jews and some with the apostles. When an attempt was made by both Gentiles and Jews with their rulers to mistreat them and to stone them, they learned of it and they fled to Lystra. They fled to Lystra and Derbe, cities in Lycaonia and the surrounding country." So the first thing that we see here in this passage is that we see the people's response to the gospel message. That Paul and Barnabas went from Pisidian Antioch to Iconium. Now, Iconium was more Greek than Roman. And because it was more Greek, there was more tolerance for ideas than there might have been in other cities. And so Paul and Barnabas went, of course, to the synagogue first. They began to preach, as was their pattern. And this synagogue had many Gentiles as well as Jews in attendance. So Luke records for us four things that happened in Iconium. First, we see in the first verse is that many believed. Paul and Barnabas told the simple truth. Jesus died to save sinners. That he is the Messiah that the Jews had been waiting for. I think it's important for us to note that godly Gentiles turn to Christianity. I mean, after all, the Bible tells us that those who search for God will find him. Now remember that we have determined that God is at work in people's lives, and that we need to find them and share Jesus with them. And that's what Paul and Barnabas did. They began in the synagogue because it would make sense that those who were searching for God would start there. And it says that many came to Christ, but not all. Because you see, the city was divided. In verse 2 it says, but the unbelieving Jews stirred up the Gentiles and poisoned their minds against their brothers. And then in verse 4 it says, but the people of the city were divided. Some sided with the Jews and some with the apostles. When an attempt was made by both Gentiles and Jews with their rulers to mistreat them and to stone them, they learned of it, they fled to Lystra and Derbe, cities of Lycaonia, into the surrounding country. You see, many Jews did not believe. And Luke tells us that they stirred up the Gentiles and they poisoned their minds against the brothers. Now, it still amazes me that two people can hear the exact same message. One will respond and the other one doesn't. Now, I don't understand why that is. I wish I did. Because Christianity is the only thing that actually makes sense to me. No other system of belief actually works. And those who didn't respond, it says, stirred up the Gentiles so that they wouldn't believe either. So we need to face the fact that there are many devoted, almost radical people who want to keep others from responding to the gospel message. Now, I mean, just think about this through election cycles, for example. We have the hushed tones that anchors use when they talk about how evangelicals may have such an impact on the election. It comes across in every major election cycle. Now, the part that I find funny is the way that they just don't get it. I mean, the fact that evangelicals would be concerned about moral issues and would not look at their own selfish interests and vote for someone who shares their values, that really shocks them, and they can't figure out why that would be. The alternative to Christianity, of course, is non-Christianity, and every form of which is a religious system. Atheism is a religious philosophy. In fact, that's why there's so much passion when people discuss it. If you step on a person's religious belief, there will be fireworks. And that's what happened at Iconium. If Paul and Barnabas were right, then there would have to be some major behavior changes. It's required if what they're saying is correct. And that was the real problem. Notice that what God does in response to the opposition. It says that God confirmed their words with miraculous signs and wonders in verse 3. Because you see, God will do whatever he needs to do to confirm his word. And in this case, it was signs and wonders. In other places, it could be something different. But God was going to authenticate their message. I think in America, change lives, I think, is the biggest selling point for any church. But yet we also find that there was opposition to the apostles in verses 5 and 6. Those who opposed the gospel couldn't agree with what they saw. I mean, God did some really amazing things to confirm his word. And rather than give in, they tried to silence the messengers. And folks, this has become the pattern for the enemy from the beginning. And it will continue. He will continue to do it even to this day. Paul and Barnabas heard about the plot and left before they were hurt, which brought them to Lystra and Derbe, where we find the people's response to the apostles. Let's look at verse 8. It says, now at Lystra there was a man sitting who could not use his feet, and he was crippled from birth, and he had never walked. He listened to Paul speaking, and Paul, looking intently at him, seeing that he had faith to be made well, he said in a loud voice, stand upright on your feet. And he sprang up and he began walking. And when the crowd saw what Paul had done, they lifted up their voices, saying in the Lycaonian, the gods have come down to us in the likeness of men. Barnabas they called Zeus, and Paul Hermes, because he was the chief speaker and the priest of Zeus, whose temple was at the entrance to the city. And they brought oxen and garlands to the gates. They wanted to offer sacrifice with the crowds. But when the apostles, Barnabas and Paul, heard of it, they tore their garments and they rushed out into the crowd crying, men, why are you doing these things? We also are just men of like nature with you. And we bring you good news that you should turn from these vain things and serve the living God, who made the heavens and the earth and the sea and all that's in them. In past generation, he allowed all the nations to walk in their own ways, yet he did not leave himself without witness. For he did good by giving you rains from heaven and fruitful seasons, satisfying your hearts with food and gladness. Even with these words, they scarcely restrained the people from offering sacrifices to them. But Jews came from Antioch and Iconium, and having persuaded the crowds, they stoned Paul and they dragged him out of the city, supposing he was dead. But when the disciples gathered about him, he rose up and he entered the city, and on the next day he went on with Barnabas to Derbe. And so in Lystra we find Paul and Barnabas coming in contact with a crippled man. He looked at the man and he called out to him to get up and walk, and the man did. Now this act so amazed the people of Lystra that they decided that these two men must be gods, not men, and so they wanted to sacrifice to them. Now, this account reminds us that there's a danger of people looking at people rather than looking to God. In fact, I've seen so much of this in my lifetime. Pastors or other leaders who are somehow put up on pedestals, and people following the leader rather than the Lord. Now, Paul and Barnabas kept referring the people back to God because he's the one that they needed to look to, because he's the only one who could satisfy their needs. They still had opposition. The Jews followed them from Iconium, and they riled the people up in order to hurt Paul and Barnabas, it says. And the apostles were stoned and left for dead. Because you see, folks, serving the Lord can be difficult, and it may even be painful. And remember, Jesus himself said that we need to count the cost. And the last thing we see here is the apostles' response to the church in verse 21. It says, when they had preached the gospel to that city and they had made many disciples, they returned to Lystra and to Iconium and to Antioch, strengthening the souls of the disciples, encouraging them to continue in the faith, and saying that through many tribulations we must enter into the kingdom of God. And when they had appointed elders for them in every church with prayer and fasting, they committed them to the Lord in whom they had believed. And then they passed through Pisidia, and they came to Pamphylia. And when they had spoken the word in Perga, they went down to Attalia. And from there they sailed to Antioch, where they had been commended to the grace of God for the work that they had fulfilled. And when they had arrived, they gathered the church together. They declared all that God had done with them, and how he had opened the door of faith to the Gentiles. And they remained a little time with the disciples. So they left Lystra, and they went to Derbe before returning home. Now three things happened in this last section. The first we see in verse 21, just as we saw earlier, that many believed. Once again, when the gospel is preached, there are always results. The second thing that we see here is that they encouraged the leaders of the churches in verses 22 through 25. They came alongside, they encouraged them, they poured into them so that the leaders would be encouraged. And the third thing that they did was that they reported what God had done. You see, members of the church in Antioch needed to know that God was blessing their efforts. And they came back and they gave what I would call God sightings. And I think that this is an important thing for us to grasp, is that two things. First of all, that when people share the gospel, others respond. It's the kingdom rule of Jesus. People respond. The response will either be acceptance or it's going to be anger. I really don't know there's no apathy in there. You're going to go one way or the other. And God will always confirm his word in a way that is needed for the situation. When we do our part, God will always do his. But the other thing I want to mention here, and I think it's important for us to note, is that when Paul and Barnabas came back to Antioch, they shared the amazing message of what God had done. They were looking at, even these God sightings weren't just needs. They were talking about lives who were being changed, whole families who were transformed. And I think that one of the dangers that we have, especially when we're talking about missions, is that we focus on the need. Folks, the need will always be there. There's never going to be a time in the history of missions, in the history of the church, where there will not be a need. However, what people give to and what people get excited about is what God is doing. So if you are sharing at your church, if you're on a missions team and if you're sharing, I would strongly recommend, in fact, I would beg you to follow the example of Paul and Barnabas. And when they came back, they shared what God had done through their ministry and the lives that have been changed, because that's what matters. That's the reason that we're here, and that's what gets people excited. So I thank you for making it to the end today. I pray that you have a wonderful time with your siblings in Christ as you worship him this week. I pray that as the word goes forth, that you would hear from God as you are singing back, that you would respond back to him with all that you are. And I look forward to seeing you again in a future video. God bless you all.